This podcast is sponsored by nobody.
Hey dudes, this is Barbie Wilde, the female Cenobite in Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, and you're listening to Tommy Throwback Kovac on Splat from the past. And if he doesn't have me on again, I'm gonna tear his soul apart.
Hey dudes, welcome to Splat from the past, the only 80s themed horror sci-fi show where things can get totally radical. Now today I will be welcoming the man, the myth, the legend. I will be talking to creature creator and special effects makeup artist Cliff Wallace, who worked on the original Hellraiser and Hellraiser 2 Hellbound. And he also worked on Waxwork and 28 Days Later and so many great movies. And we're going to be talking about all of that stuff today. It's going to be a great show. You know, I've kind of sworn off special effects makeup artists and creature creators the last few years because I had a couple weird experiences a couple years ago trying to get some of those guys on here. But you know, when I was looking to see who I could talk to for the 35th anniversary of Hellraiser, thought, why not Cliff Wallace? He's like the only one left available out there, because I've talked to, you know, Barbie and Nicholas and Simon, and I can't, you know, get through to Ashley Lawrence, so why not Cliff Wallace, you know? And it's pretty interesting talking to creature makeup effects artists. They have a very unique point of view of the artistic, you know, value of the project, and it's always great to hear new perspectives, not just the same perspectives from actors, you know. And once again, it's going to be a great honor to talk to him today. And he also did Hellboy 2. Gotta get into that as well. So yeah, here is my interview with Cliff Wallace. Hey Cliff, can you hear me?
I can, Tommy. Hello.
Hello, sir. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you.
This is such a great honor. Thank you for taking the time today.
That's all right. It's no problem at all.
So, going back in time, did you gravitate toward creature and makeup early on in your childhood?
I was always interested in monsters in horror films. A lot of the Hammer stuff, Amicus stuff. We used to have a program in England called Appointment with Fear, which was on a Friday night and had a double bill of horror films. So I always used to watch those from an early age. We also had Jerry Anderson in England as well, making programs like Stingray and Thunderbirds and things. So I was really interested in those. So I'd always been kind of interested in the fantastic, I suppose. I didn't really start thinking about doing makeup effects as a career until I saw The Howling.
Wow.
And that was the first film that I saw where, you know, makeups were actually moving. It came out in England a few weeks before American Werewolf in London. I don't know whether it was the same in the States.
Right.
But it kind of stole American Werewolf's thunder a bit for me. But I'd read the Gary Bradner book of The Howling, which, you know, apart from anything else, had a great sex scene, and I think that was one of the things that got me excited. So I went to see The Howling and was just blown away by it. And then I found out that the guy who did the effects, Rob Bottin, was, you know, younger than I was at that time, you know.
Yeah.
And so I really sort of started getting interested in makeup effects and looking at all the books I could find in the library, which wasn't very much. I mean, there was a book called Stage Makeup by Richard Corson. Not very much else, actually. And looking at things like Fangoria, which was in its very early stages then, and looking at pictures of makeup artists and you know, their labs, and seeing if you could work out what was in the background and what materials they were using. And then I started looking in Screen International when I went to college. I went to a college in London that did a film studies course, which is usually I think it was a media studies course, actually. It was probably the first one in England. And it was a place you went to if you didn't know what to do with your life. You know, it had a really good, TV centre there.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a good place to, you know, to learn to make movies and not have to actually work very hard. So I was kind of getting into makeup effects when I was there, and I was also starting to look in Screen International and seeing what films were being made in England, and just writing to whoever was in charge of makeup on those films. And the first person I wrote to was Rick Baker, who was doing Greystoke in England.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of wrote to him and said, I'm interested, you know, could I come down and see you? And surprisingly, he said yes, you know. So I went down to Elstree Film Studios, which wasn't very far from where I lived, and met Rick Baker, and he just told me so much stuff. But seeing what was being done on Greystoke, I was so blown away by it. And I really hadn't done any work myself at the time. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, this is too complicated. I'm never going to get into this. But I sort of kept interested, but it did put me off for about 6 or 8 months, actually. Because I thought, you know, the animatronics and things like that was just so complex.
Yeah.
And then eventually, there was another werewolf film being made in England called Company of Wolves, and a guy called Chris Tucker was in charge of that, who did The Elephant Man. Mm-hmm. And I went down to see him, and that sort of really struck home the difference between American effects at the time and British effects. You know, mm-hmm. The British stuff was sort of all held together with elastic bands, and you know, it was just so far removed from what was going on in the States, and I suddenly could see myself doing it. You know, mm-hmm. And that was really the start for me. Eventually, I started making masks mm-hmm. In my bedroom at home, like many people do, and around Halloween time, I got invited onto a kids' TV show, which was a live show. Went out on a Saturday morning, and I took a few masks on and made one of the presenters up. And while I was on, someone from a makeup effects company rang up and offered me a job. Mm-hmm. And that job was on a pretty awful early Clive Barker written film called Rawhead Rex. And so I went and worked on Rawhead Rex for a few weeks. It was being done by a company called Coast to Coast, who did Max Headroom. Mm-hmm. That was the one thing that they were kind of famous for. And so I went and worked on this Rawhead Rex for a few weeks. And while I was there was a guy who was making molds there, and he knew that I was I read all the books of Blood. I was kind of interested in Clive Barker. I was also thinking that, you know, I would get into movies through makeup effects, and I'd probably do that for about a year, and then I'd move on to something else, you know, because I like writing horror. That was one of the things that I was really interested in. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he said, you know, if you like horror and you like Clive Barker, he's going to direct a movie in about 6 months' time called Hellraiser. Mm-hmm. And so he told me who was going to be in charge of the effects, and I went to see him. It was a guy called Bob Keane, and he gave me a job. So we had about 6 months waiting for Hellraiser to come around, really. So we were just doing sort of adverts and just sort of learning the craft, really. But when I started on Hellraiser, I really made nothing bigger than a mask. You know, I hadn't worked on a suit or anything like that. And the first job I got given on Hellraiser was to do the Frank suit, the Skin Man suit, which was a huge, big job for someone who'd, you know, only been in the industry for 5 minutes. But Bob Keane's team on Hellraiser was composed mainly of really young guys who'd only done a film, 2 films at the most, who were all really enthusiastic. I mean, Bob was great at sort of choosing people who were enthusiastic, really, beyond the talent. I mean, my talent was certainly very embryonic at that time. But he just let us go with things. I mean, he's only about 2 years older than me, I think. So the whole crew was very, very young and very inexperienced. But we were all really excited about makeup effects and wanted to try new things.
Yeah. So, were you aware of what a genius Clive Barker was, like, from the moment you met him?
Pretty much. Yeah. I mean, I'd sort of because I was interested in Clive as a writer. There was a thing in England called the British Fantasy Society, which was basically it was a club for horror writers, really, and horror fans. And so I've met Clive actually a few times at those sort of events. And I think when the film of Nightmare on Elm Street came out, Time Out, which was a magazine in England, did a horror story competition, and Clive was one of the guests, one of the guest judges, and so I wrote a story for that, and I came second. The first prize was a trip to Las Vegas, because that's the city that never sleeps. And the second prize was a Nightmare on Elm Street T-shirt, and I won the Nightmare on Elm Street T-shirt. So,
do you still have it?
Yes, I do. Actually, I found it the other day. It's white with sort of Freddy in an outline, sort of fluorescent writing, Freddy with his arms extended from the first one.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and I can still get into it. That was the scary thing.
Yeah. That's so cool.
We're talking 35, 36 years ago, I guess, when that came out. So yeah, but the first time I met Clive, I mean, he probably is one of the only bona fide geniuses I've ever met in my life.
Yeah. So did you read the book first before the screenplay?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I mean, I read all the books of blood, and I read the Hellbound. I read everything that was around up to that point. But by the time we got to doing Hellraiser, Clive was he was really in the ascendant, and you couldn't turn on the telly without seeing him. There was sort of lots of late night shows in England, lots of chat shows, and he'd always be on those, and things like that. There was as we were shooting Hellraiser, he had a show on in the West End called The Secret Life of Cartoons. So he was absolutely everywhere at that time. And it was really through the power of his charisma that he was such a good guest on those chat shows. He was fantastic at presenting himself. I was writing stuff at the time, and it was a good time for sort of young British horror writers to get in. And Clive was very, very sort of helpful in getting my stuff out there and getting it published in magazines and things like that. And to lots of other guys who wanted to sort of get into writing horror at the same time. He's very enthusiastic about the genre, and other people's writing, and the whole sort of British wave of stuff that came in his wake.
Did you and Clive spend months trying to figure out the way the Cenobites would look, or did he already have an idea of how they would look?
He had an idea. There was quite a long period, probably about 3 months, when they were trying to raise the finance to do Hellraiser, and Bob Keane, who owned Image Animation, the company who did the makeup effects, used to take 3 or 4 of us over to Clive's house every Friday night in Crouch End, and we used to sit there with Clive and do little drawings of what we thought Cenobite should look like. You know, I mean, the only one that Clive had drawn really was Pinhead. The other ones were kind of up for grabs. And they all pretty much came out of those sessions, as did the design for Channard in Hellbound. Actually, came out of that sort of 3-month period where we were sort of meeting up every Friday and doing designs. But I mean, Clive had all the books, you know, all the sort of body piercing books, all the magazines, that sort of stuff really wasn't in the mainstream, you know. But Clive knew the people who were involved in that scene. He knew what clubs, what nights things occurred on, and you know, he could get you into most of those places. And he also had a lot of sort of Vesalius prints and things like that. I mean, the Skinned Man as a sort of as an image had been with Clive for quite a long time. And in fact, if you look at things like there was a film before Rawhead Rex that he wrote a screenplay for, which was called Underworld. I think it was called Transmutations in the States. Now there is a scene that he wrote towards the end of that film where I think it's a doctor played by Denham Elliott pulls his skin off and then pins burst out of his body.
Yeah.
So those kind of images were already pretty well formed in Clive's mind, and I think there's a Skin Man in the Forbidden Desert as well. So that a lot of that imagery was already in place, you know.
Yeah.
And just needed fleshing out a little bit. But I think it's fair to say that most of us had absolutely no idea how we were going to realize any of that stuff.
Whose makeup was the most challenging and exhausting to do?
Well, I'm going to say the one that I did. I mean, mine was probably the longest one because it was a full body suit, you know.
Yeah.
And I, as I said, I never really sculpted anything bigger than a head before. The other main problem was that we didn't have a foam latex oven that was big enough to do anything that size on. So that whole suit was sort of sculpted in very small areas. You know, I'd sculpt the top of the arm, and then the middle of the arm, and then the hands, and then I made a pair of ribs, and I made some stuff to go under the ribs, and it was all made piecemeal because we really only had a sort of a very normal sized oven that you know, an old Gallenkamp oven that was about the size of a domestic oven. So we really couldn't build anything bigger than that. So it all had to be done piecemeal, and I think that the Frank was only supposed to shoot for about 2 or 3 days at the most, you know. So in the weeks before shooting, we used to get Oliver Smith, who played Frank, to come over to our little workshop, which was at Cricklewood Studios, where they were shooting. And he used to just stand there all day, and I used to assemble this suit on him, really, and paint it on him. You know, and until we had a workable suit. But it was, as I say, only really supposed to shoot for 2 or 3 days, and it was just held together with slime and blood, really. It was it was not a fantastic suit in any way, but it did the job, as most of the stuff in Hellraiser does, I think.
Yeah, Nicholas told me he couldn't see or hear out of his makeup.
Yeah, that's right. He was. We didn't call him Chatterer. We called him Poor Bastard because he couldn't see, hear. He regularly fell over on set, tripped over things. But it was a great design, Chatterer. It was done by a guy called Nigel Booth, who's still in the industry, and it was just a fantastic looking thing, and probably something that hasn't been said, I think, was that Clive, most of the people who were in Hellraiser were obviously Clive's friends,
right.
And were people who worked on plays with him in the Dog Company and things like that. And but Clive actually chose the characters that he felt would fit the people playing them. So Nick had a lot of dental work in his youth. I think he had several operations because he had an underbite or something like that.
Yeah.
And so he'd gone through a lot of dental torture already. And Simon, who played Butterball, had been a sort of small, large kid and got bullied a lot at school. So it was kind of Clive, giving them characters he thought they would. They deserved, I suppose.
Yes, Simon's makeup is pretty impressive and horrific at the same time.
Yeah, I mean it's actually very simple. It's just a mask. Nick's makeup and Simon's makeup actually. So they were fairly easy. I mean, compared to Grace Kirby, who played the female Cenobite in the first film, and to Frank, to Oliver Smith, and to Doug, their makeups were sort of 3 or 4 hours every time, whereas Nick's and Simon's were half hour at most. So
yeah.
So I know Nicholas says, "Oh, it was terrible, I couldn't see it." I think, but he had it easy, really.
The budget on the movie was like what, $3 million? It looks like a $10 million movie.
No, it was nothing like that actually.
Oh.
But I think the original budget was about £800,000. So that's
okay.
So what's that? That's probably in those days it was under $1 million anyway, under $1 million,
Right.
US dollars. What happened was that sort of halfway through the shooting, New Line started seeing the rushes, which initially Clive and Chris Figg were very wary about showing them. But eventually they started seeing the rushes and thinking, oh, okay, this isn't the straight-to-video film that we'd imagined. And it actually could be quite decent. And so they put in quite a bit more money, probably about another third of the budget. And that's really to spice up some of the scenes. The main thing was that was the big transformation scene, the birth scene, the birth of Frank, which wasn't in the original script. What happened originally was that Frank was bricked up in the wall in the upstairs attic, and he just sort of fell out of the wall as a sort of mummified corpse sort of thing. And so it was very simple. It was just a breakaway wall on a skeleton that fell out of the wall. There certainly wasn't that big sort of grand birth sequence. That was all added later. I mean, the other thing that was really, really annoying was with the extra money that the New Line put in, they tried to make what was ostensibly a very British film seem like it was American. So they started dubbing people's accents. They had people walking around with, I don't know, New York Jets baseball caps on and things like that. But it was plainly England. There was a British rail train. There was so many things that were plainly English about it. But they, as I say, went through and redubbed people's accents to make them sound American and things like that. I mean, it was a great shame to me that Frank Oliver Smith, all his lines were dubbed by an American actor who's just doing a perfect impersonation of what the English actor did, but with a slightly more transatlantic accent.
Mm-hmm.
So things like that were annoying to me.
Yeah. Tony Randell directed the second one. What was it like working with him?
Quite different. I mean, Tony had been around for a fair part of the Hellraiser shoot. In fact, he was the sort of troublemaker that the New World sent over to overlook what these what this strange man was doing in this tiny little studio in Cricklewood. So he was quite immersed in Hellraiser, and I think fought a lot of the battles that needed to be fought on Hellraiser, and was probably responsible for getting the extra budget and things like that to polish the film.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, when it was being made, it didn't have the great Chris Young's score or things like that. The original music was done by a group called Coil, who were friends of Clive's, and I don't know if you've heard it, but that's a great score as well.
Oh yes.
But obviously not as grand or commercial as the score that they ended up with.
Yeah, I think the second one is pretty good. I mean, considering it's pretty much a redoing of the first one in many ways. And I do think Barbie Wilde is the quintessential female Cenobite. I'm a little biased because she's been on here 5 times.
Of course, yeah. Well, I mean, Grace Kirby, who was, I think, Clive's cousin, who plays the female Cenobite in the first film, really hated it.
Yeah.
and has never talked about it since. You don't see her turning up at conventions or anything like that. And she really did it as a favour to Clive, but she absolutely hated it, I think.
Yeah.
And as I say, has never talked about the experience again. It was obviously too hideous to.
Oh, that's a shame.
I mean, I think she was a school teacher or something.
Oh, okay.
So it was a very different. It was a very different line of work for her for a few months.
Yeah. How did you get involved with Waxwork?
Waxwork really came about. It after Hellraiser was a success, we, as a company, Image Animation started getting offered a lot more stuff, but Tony Hickox, who directed Waxwork, was again a good friend of Bob Keane, who ran Image Animation. And in fact, when I first went to Bob's, the first film that they were talking about making was a film called, I think it was called Death Star or something like that. Mm-hmm. But it was basically a sort of Viking thing, and it had a dragon in it, and that was the first film that I was going to be employed on, I think. So Bob had known Tony Hickox for for a fair period of time, and so when Waxworks came about, we all jetted off. Well, a few of us jetted off to America. First time I'd ever been to LA, which was pretty cool. I'd been in the industry about 8 months, and I was suddenly going to LA, and driving down Sunset Boulevard and seeing Hellraiser posters everywhere was pretty cool. And Waxworks was a huge, it was a great fun movie to work on, because it was basically all your favorite Universal monsters that
Yep.
you had to do a different spin on them, because obviously you couldn't just recreate the Universal stuff, because that was all copyrighted, So, but it was a great to do, sort of a werewolf and a snake woman and a golem and Dracula and the Thing and all sorts, So it was very cool, and of course there's some great actors in it, There's Patrick McNee. Again, if you're interested in anything sort of fantastic or anything like that in England, you've seen the Avengers, so Patrick McNee was great, and David Warner and Miles O'Keefe, who was in 10 and things like that. So it had a great course, it had a great cast, and
Foreman.
All those people, sort of very early roles for those, and Tony Hickox, of course, was the son of Douglas Hickox, who'd done quite a few Hammer movies and things like that. So, and of course, he ended up directing Hellraiser 3.
Oh yeah, did he ask you to get involved in that?
Well, I didn't actually work on Hellraiser 3, and I can't remember why. I think it was I stayed at Image Animation until Nightbreed, really, and I left fairly early during Nightbreed's production, and it was really because it's my one great regret, actually, that I left that production. But the reason I left was because Clive had sort of sold it to us as being the sort of Star Wars of monster movies, and we had more money than we ever had to do this big sort of underground city of monsters. And Clive had always had this thing that it took me about 20 years to get around to his way of thinking and appreciate. But he had this thing that sculpted creatures in the way that sort of Rob Bottin or Rick Baker or Steve Johnson or any of my heroes were doing in the States. He said that sculpted stuff looked sculpted. Okay.
Yeah.
So his idea for Nightbreed was that stuff should be constructed. Okay, and that would have a totally different look than sculpted stuff. And he on Hellraiser we had a book about the mummies of Palermo. I don't know if you've ever seen this. Palermo is a town in Sicily, and beneath that town there are catacombs, and in those catacombs are bodies of clergymen mostly. But these things were once human beings, and they now look like they're kind of leathery. They don't look as though they were ever human. And if you said to any Hollywood studio at the time, sculpt us a mummy, it wouldn't look like those things in Palermo, which were really scary but real. And I'd always had this thing that for movies, you do what people expect to see rather than what is actually real. I had sort of forensic pathology books and things like that, where I remember one picture specifically, which was a guy who'd lost his foot, and coming out of his leg in this photo is what I swear to you looks like spaghetti. Just looks like spaghetti. And I always used to say to Clive, that's real, but it doesn't look real.
Yeah.
Okay. And when you're seeing a film, people know that the stuff has been made for the film. Okay.
Yeah.
They know it doesn't actually exist in real life. So I always wanted to do a sort of filmic reality rather than things that were actually real. And Clive was always, no, because, that's been created by an artist and it looks sculpted, and real stuff doesn't look like that. There's a way that Rick Baker sculpts a wrinkle. It has a depth, it has a curve, but it's just different. Mm-hmm. And I could never see that. And it took me years to get around to the fact that, sometimes you can make something out of a black plastic bag and it'll look more fantastic than anything that's actually sculpted. You can something that is just silicone mixed up with a bit of blood, will, and scooped into a wound, will suddenly look better than something that's sculpted, because it has a sort of organic texture that you don't get from sculpting in clay. And it took me ages to sort of come around to that. So on Nightbreed, we were trying all these experiments. One character was like a person who was covered in polystyrene balls and then sprayed blue and things like that. And to me, that just looked like a person who was covered in polystyrene balls. It looked like really bad art school stuff.
Yeah.
And I just thought, this isn't right. This isn't the way it should be done. So rather arrogantly, I thought, no, I'm not going to have anything to do with this. And so I sort of left and went to work on something that did have sculpted creatures in it. But it was a huge mistake. I mean, I think what actually ended up happening on Nightbreed was that is that they did go back and sculpt things in a traditional way. The experiments didn't really work. And the reason they didn't work, again, it took me ages to figure out why, is that, if you think of someone like Picasso, he could draw really well, okay? But he evolved this style that you think of now as a Picasso style, with noses on the side of your head and all the features moved around and everything else. But he could draw really well, and I think you have to be really good at the sort of basics of makeup effects to be able to do that weird stuff and to make it work. And actually, at the time, none of us were capable of doing that. There is, that sort of thinking that Clive had at that time. I know I've spoken to Steve Johnson quite a lot about it, and Steve did the effects for The Last Illusion, and in that movie there's the start of all that sort of constructed makeup effects that became very popular years later. I think the sort of stuff with Nix's death, where there's sort of this weird stuff sort of coming out of his skin and things were all done with sort of inflated black plastic bags and things like that, reversed. And it's all cool looking stuff and stuff that looks totally different. But that was the sort of stuff that was being done, sort of years later in Men in Black and things like that, and The Abyss and all that. But at the time, I think that was too much of a leap for most of the people working in to grasp. These days I construct a heck of a lot of stuff rather than sculpting it, but it took a long time. We didn't really talk about Hellbound, did we?
Yeah.
Got waylaid already, Cliff. So what was it like working with Tony Randall? Yeah, he was the main difference between Hellbound and Hellraiser was that Clive wasn't around very much,
right?
Because he was suddenly hugely popular after Hellraiser, so and he had his first the Damnation game, I think, came out during the shooting of Hellraiser, and wasn't a vast success, but WeWorld, which was the sort of first sort of horror fantasy crossover book that he did, came out just before Hellbound started shooting, I think, and suddenly his career just took off, and so he didn't direct the second movie. Tony Randall did. Tony was sort of he was pretty au fait with the Hellraiser world, and it was written by Pete Atkins, of course, who was a friend of Clive's from a long way back, another dog company person, and that was the first. I think that was the first screenplay that Pete had written. And it was, it was conceived as a bigger thing. We actually went to hell and saw Leviathan and things like that. It's a lot of people's favorite Hellraiser movie. It's not mine. I think some of the effects in it are not great. Some of the visual effects weren't great at the time, I don't think, either, and certainly haven't improved in the meantime. I was interested to see the trailer for the new Hellraiser film had a lot of that sort of imagery from the second film. A lot of the Leviathan stuff, the sort of pyramid in the sky and all that in it, and it looks great. So hopefully they'll get it right 35 years later. That would be brilliant.
Yeah, that would be great. How was working on 28 Days Later?
28 Days Later was fantastic. I mean, Danny Boyle is probably the nicest man you'll ever meet. But he really wasn't very au fait with zombie movies. In fact, we weren't allowed to say that 28 Days Later was a zombie movie. But when I got the script, the first thing I said to Clive is, "This is a zombie movie, and this thing comes from Day of the Dead, and the rest of it's kind of heavily influenced by J.G. Ballard. I don't know if you've ever read any J.G. Ballard.
No.
You know who J.G. Ballard is? Okay, no. J.G. Ballard is an English science fiction writer. He wrote things like Crash, which the Cronenberg film is based on. He wrote things like High Rise, which was made into a film fairly recently, Ben Wheatley film, I think. And there was a lot of Ballardian influenced stuff in 28 Days Later. A lot of stuff from a book called High Rise. There was a lot of stuff from a short story collection called Low Flying Aircraft. I was a big Ballard fan, so I could kind of pick out these references fairly quickly. And the fact that the lead character was called Jim. In fact, on the credits, he's called Jim Ballard, so there's a bit of giveaway there as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Danny wasn't really au fait with any of the zombie movies, you know. But it was quite obvious that it was a zombie movie right from the start. We were shooting it at a very interesting time. I mean, it's I think 9/11 happened on about the second or third day that we were shooting. One of the scenes that we shot straight after 9/11 was the scene in the petrol station where Jim first meets Selena, and there's the petrol station gets blown up. I don't know if you remember the scene, but they actually did that for real at a disused petrol station in East London. Unfortunately, that petrol station was on the flight path to the central London airport. So there was this huge explosion by an airport a couple of days after 9/11, and every fire department in London turned up to this fire, and the film nearly got shut down there and then, you know. Because the whole sort of thought on 28 Days Later was that it would be shot sort of dogme style, which was the kind of the sort of Lars von Trier approach that was kind of popular at the time, shooting things not on movie cameras but on sort of handheld cheap digital cameras which were just coming in at the time, and just going to these places and shooting, often without permission. So all those sort of shots of London, deserted London, were basically done at about 5 o'clock in the morning when there wasn't many people around, and the crew would just be handed digital cameras, you know, and told to go and stand in various positions and just film whatever you could get, and that sequence was sort of put together from that. I mean, Danny used his daughter, who was at college at the time, to basically bought a lot of the most attractive of her college friends that she could bring down to the shoot, and they would stand at the ends of streets in London with £10 notes and say, "Could you not walk down this street for the next 5 minutes, please? Here's a £10 note." So that's how a lot of it was shot. But eventually, as we went through the filming, it got more and more like a movie. You know, it was although it was still being shot on these digital cameras, you know, there was a great deal of care taken in the way it was lit and things like that. So it ended up being a more sort of polished film than people were expecting at the start. But that whole sort of shooting things on the fly, I think that's probably why I got the job, because sort of by then I've become quite good at winging it, which really was something that came around from working at Image Animation and never having much money, but a lot of imagination, and that whole sort of the whole sort of approach, the whole sort of winging it approach really came from that, you know, and remaking old stuff, you know, to make it look like new stuff, again, probably something that's never been revealed about the Frank creature that sits up at the end of the transformation sequence. That was made for another movie, and was rescued. It used to be in England that when films were made, most of the props from them ended up in containers, on the back lot, and so a sort of favourite pastime for a lot of us was breaking into these containers and seeing what we could find in them, and that Frank puppet was actually a puppet from a more famous, more expensive film with a different skin stuck on it.
Yeah, it's a great movie. How about Hellboy 2?
Hellboy 2, again, I'm working with Guillermo was probably, the coolest job imaginable. I don't know if you know, but Guillermo was a makeup effects artist in Mexico before he started directing films.
Oh, okay.
So he pretty much, he's a monster kid. He'd done the Dick Smith course and everything, and originally Hellboy 2 was going to be made in England, which was one of the reasons I got a call about that. I'd also started, by that time in my career, I also started doing these sort of fairly weird creatures that weren't really like a lot of the other creatures that were around at the time. I'd happily stick a castle on a monster's head and things like that, because I was looking at different influences. What you often find is that makeup artists will only look at other film stuff, and I'd sort of started looking a long time ago at sort of at fashion designers and at weird architecture and all this sort of thing, and trying to bring those sort of stuff into my work just to make it look different, really. Mm-hmm. And Guillermo's very sort of, Guillermo has an aesthetic, and he looks for people who have a similar sort of aesthetic to his, and that's really why the stuff in his films looks different. So he'd actually contacted me about he had a script for a remake of The Witches, the Nick Rogue film of
it's a great movie.
Thing. Instead, now I was a huge Nick Rogue fan, and a huge fan of The Witches, and he sent me the script for his version of The Witches, and it was really, really similar to the original, and I think the original is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And so I went to this meeting with Guillermo and had a really good time, and we went around various comic shops in London and things, and at the end he said, so what do you think? Do you want to do The Witches? I said, well, yeah, I'll do it, but if you ever do Hellboy 2, I'll be much more interested in doing that. And anyway, 2 weeks later, he rang me up and said, forget Witches, we're not doing that, we're doing Hellboy 2. So that was kind of cool, and I got to meet Mike Mignola and all that. So it was really great. And there was about, there was one day when we were shooting over in Budapest, and there was a big red monster fighting a big blue monster, surrounded by a whole town of other creatures looking on, and you just thought, I was just standing there watching this going on and thinking, well, it don't get much better than this, really. If you're in makeup, there was people from the States, there was Spectral Motion, there was DDT, there was Spectral, who did the stuff on Pan's Labyrinth and Devil's Backbone and all this, and there was a couple of English movies there, and it was just really cool, and it, I thought at the time it's not going to get better than this, and it hasn't really. But yeah, what a cool job to work on, and some just terrific stuff, I mean, the Angel of Death is just a neat looking thing, but interestingly, we were all looking at the same sort of references, and people like Wayne Barlow was designing stuff and things like that, and the Angel of Death wasn't actually a Barlow design, but has that sort of very Barlow-esque head shape and things like that. And I'd done a few things that looked quite similar to that, and because I looked at Barlow stuff and sort of extrapolated from that. So it was interesting that all the shops were suddenly doing similar stuff, because we were all dipping into this sort of this myth pool that Guillermo created by pulling in all the artists that he liked, and that's why stuff for Guillermo movies looks different from any other movie,
Yeah. And then you enter Ray Harryhausen territory with the remake of Clash of the Titans. How was working on that?
It was interesting. I mean, it was we did a lot of stuff for Clash that wasn't actually in the film. I was working for an English special effects guy called Neil Corbold, and we did some really cool animatronic stuff, but a lot of the stuff in the film is all CG and things. So it was kind of interesting from that point of view. But we did a cool sort of dead scorpion and the Sharon figure and things like that. So there was some neat stuff to do on that. It was okay, but it was it was never going to be to me who
the original
was brought up on Harry. It was never going to be as good as the original.
Yeah. The original's a great film.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, for sort of most sort of monster fans, Harryhausen was such a huge influence, and just the way that, if you think of something like the Cyclops, just the sort of stance that thing has, with the shoulders back and the way it moves and everything, is just so cool, and you never get that with the CG figure, unfortunately.
Yeah. Do you have any upcoming projects you can mention?
One of the things I've been doing recently, I think we finished in May, was it's a new Ridley Scott film, which is a biography of Napoleon. I think Ridley Scott is probably the greatest filmmaker that our country's ever produced. I've worked on a couple of Ridley Scott films before. I did Black Hawk Down, and I did and I did Kingdom of Heaven, both in Morocco, and we started work on a film called Nottingham, which eventually ended up being a Robin Hood film they did. But I haven't worked on a Ridley Scott film for about 15 years. And I went to see The Last Duel, which sort of came out in England during lockdown, so very few people saw it. And I just thought, this is such a cool movie. I used to work on things like that. Why am I doing this anymore? And then I went to the premiere of House of Gucci, and they had Ridley on a satellite link, and he was talking about Napoleon, and I just thought, well, I've got to try and get on that, because it's proper filmmaking, it's always epic filmmaking with Ridley. There's always beautiful sets and loads of actors and horses, and you just don't see that anymore. I've been working on a Marvel film before that, and sort of standing on the set, which was basically a load of TV screens, which is the way most films are shot these days. Used to be that you stood in front of a green screen for hours, but now you sit surrounded by banks of LEDs,
Yeah.
And to me, that isn't filmmaking. That's
I agree.
It's just changed, It's just changed so much over the last few years. But working on a Ridley Scott film was, as fantastic as it always was,
Yeah.
They don't make them like that anymore. So
No.
that was great.
No, he's a genius, and you've worked with so many geniuses. Did I read right? You just did the reboot of the Toxic Avenger.
Yeah, I did work on that. I didn't actually go on the shoot for that, but yeah, that kind of looks interesting. Don't really know that much about it. Can't tell you that much about it either.
Yeah.
I was mainly doing the sort of main villain in it, which is Kevin Bacon's character, but it's not actually him when he's playing the creature that he turns into. But I was working on that. So yeah, I've worked on that. That's kind of cool. One of the cool things, I guess, within the last sort of 4 or 5 years that's happened was that I did a short film with a bunch of guys I've met up in Norfolk in England, called The Birch, and I've worked with these guys before, and they asked me if I had any stories that were knocking around that had a cool creature in. So I gave them this story that I had called The Birch, and we made a short film based on it. And it got about 40 million views on YouTube, which is more views than most films get. And so that was picked up for a TV show by Facebook Watch, and they made 2 series of The Birch. So that was kind of cool, It was almost like going back to how I started, really, writing stuff rather than making stuff. Although I did make the character for it, obviously.
Yeah, that is so fantastic. Cliff, thank you so much for coming on and telling all these great stories.
My pleasure. Well, hopefully. It was Clive's birthday yesterday, so that's...
Oh, yeah.
He was 70 yesterday, so happy birthday, Clive. Let's hope the new version of Hellraiser is good.
Yeah.
It's had some fairly good reviews, I think, hasn't it? Have you read any reviews of it yet?
Not yet.
Okay, well, it seems to look like it's done quite well. It's certainly in the right ballpark. I have a great deal of faith in the director, actually. It's a guy called David Bruckner. Have you heard of him or seen any of his films?
I've heard the name, but I haven't seen any of his films.
Okay, well, one I definitely recommend that you check out is a film called The Ritual, which was the film that he made before the last film he did, which I think was called The Night House, which was very good as well. But The Ritual is based on a book by an English horror writer called Adam Neville, who's a fantastic horror writer. And The Ritual is just a fantastic, scary film with a great creature in it. and definitely worth checking out. So when I heard that Bruckner was in charge of Hellraiser, that's a big tick right there for me. I did actually nearly go out and work on the new Hellraiser film. Unfortunately, I just signed to do this blooming Marvel thing that I was talking about earlier a few weeks before, so I couldn't do it, which was a bit of a heartbreaker because it would have been a good sort of cyclical end, I think.
Yeah. Well, Cliff.
But let's hope it's good.
Awesome. Well, Cliff, have a great night over there and be safe out there.
All right, Tommy, look after yourself, mate.
Thank you, sir.
Cheers.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye now.
Well, there you have it. Cliff Wallace. Ain't he a cool dude? Oh, what a great guy, huh? Great stories there. I enjoyed talking to him. It was 10 p.m. in the UK when we started that interview, and I am so grateful. Thank you so much, Cliff. Doug Bradley once described the Hellraiser movies in a nutshell. He once said, "Hell is a prison. The Cenobites are the prison guards. Pinhead is the warden. The puzzle box the key to the jail. And the demons are the escaped inmates." That is the best description of the Hellraiser series in a nutshell. Specifically the first one. I love that. Happy birthday, Clive Barker. Well, until next time, this is Tommy Throwback Kovac saying, there's no shame in living in the past, because the present sucks. Later, dudes.